The house stood tall and proud, a beacon of warmth and light. The lawn, a perfect emerald green, stretched out before it like a welcome mat. And it belonged to Joey Weaver. Joey Weaver was living the American dream. He had it all: the beautiful wife, the adorable kids, the big house in the suburbs. He was living proof that anything was possible if you just set your mind to it. One ordinary afternoon, as Joey was sorting through the day's mail, a faded envelope caught his eye. The handwriting on the front sent a jolt through him, a name he hadn't seen or heard in years: Robby Miller. The reunion was a surreal experience, a strange mix of familiar faces and forgotten names. Joey reminisced about old times, shared stories, and for a brief moment, it was as if they were teenagers again. And then he saw him, Robby. Time had not been kind to Robby. His face was etched with lines of hardship. They spent the rest of the evening catching up, sharing stories, and bridging the gap that the years had created. Despite their vastly different paths, they found themselves falling back into the easy camaraderie of their youth. As the night drew to a close, Joey found himself genuinely happy to have reconnected with his old friend. He invited Robby over for dinner, eager to introduce him to his family. The following Saturday, Robby arrived at Joey's doorstep, a bouquet of flowers in hand. Joey welcomed him with open arms, eager to share his good fortune with his old friend. Sarah, ever the gracious hostess, made Robby feel welcome. Dinner was a lively affair, filled with laughter, shared stories, and a genuine sense of warmth. As the evening progressed, however, a subtle shift occurred. A shadow seemed to fall over Robby's face. The seed of envy, planted earlier, began to take root. Joey, oblivious to the storm brewing within his friend, remained the picture of contentment. The weeks that followed the reunion were a blur of basketball games, backyard barbecues, and shared memories. Joey, eager to rekindle their friendship, made time for Robby despite his demanding work schedule. Robby, initially hesitant, seemed to blossom under Joey's attention. Joey, caught up in the nostalgia of their rekindled friendship, failed to notice the subtle changes in Robby's demeanor. One sunny afternoon, as they were shooting hoops in Joey's driveway, Robby turned to him, a wistful look in his eyes. "You know, Joey, you always did have it easy," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Joey laughed, brushing off the comment as playful envy. As the weeks turned into months, Joey and Robby's conversations grew more intimate. They shared their hopes, their fears, their regrets. Joey, accustomed to keeping his emotions bottled up, found himself confiding in Robby in ways he hadn't done with anyone else. Robby, in turn, revealed his own vulnerabilities. Joey, his heart heavy with sympathy, listened patiently, offering words of encouragement and support. One evening, as they were sharing a bottle of whiskey in Joey's study, Robby's demeanor shifted. "It's not fair, Joey," he slurred, his words heavy with resentment. "You have everything, and I have nothing." Joey, taken aback by the bitterness in Robby's voice, tried to reason with him. "Robby, it's not a competition," he said, his voice firm but gentle. But Robby wasn't listening. He continued to rant, his words fueled by alcohol and years of suppressed envy. "That's enough, Robby," Joey said, his jaw clenched. Robby, his face flushed with anger, stood up to face him, his eyes blazing with a dangerous light. "You think you're better than me, don't you, Joey?" he spat, his words dripping with venom. Joey, his anger replaced by a cold wave of fear, realized that he had misjudged Robby. Robby stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. The following days were filled with a disquieting tension. Joey, haunted by the look in Robby's eyes, couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He found himself watching his back, his senses on high alert. One evening, while driving home from work, Joey spotted Robby's car parked a few blocks from his house. His heart skipped a beat, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. He slowed down, his eyes scanning the street, searching for any sign of his former friend. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He drove home, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. The seed of doubt had taken root, and it was slowly poisoning his peace of mind. The following days passed in a blur of forced normalcy. Joey tried to maintain a facade of composure for the sake of his family, but the fear lingered. He was like a man walking a tightrope, aware that one misstep could send him plummeting into the abyss. The Weaver household slept. A peaceful silence blanketed the house. A sharp crack, like a twig snapping underfoot, shattered the stillness. Joey, his sleep light, stirred, his subconscious registering the sound as out of place. Another sound, this time a muffled thump, sent a jolt of adrenaline through him. He sat up in bed, his heart pounding in his chest. "Someone's downstairs," he hissed, his eyes wide with fear. "Call the police now." Sarah, startled awake, fumbled for her phone as Joey grabbed the baseball bat he kept under the bed. Heart pounding, Joey crept down the stairs, each creak of the wooden steps seeming deafening in the silence. The living room was bathed in shadows, the furniture looming like menacing giants in the darkness. He moved cautiously, his grip tightening on the baseball bat, his eyes scanning the room for any sign of movement. A flicker of movement in the hallway leading to the kitchen caught his eye. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. There was someone there, a dark silhouette barely visible in the dim light. Joey Weaver, narrator. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice trembling slightly. Silence. He took a step closer, his heart pounding against his ribs. Joey Weaver, narrator. "I said, who's there?" he repeated, his voice gaining strength. "Get out of my house or I'm calling the police." He heard a muffled curse, followed by a soft thud, as if something heavy had been dropped. He took another step, his finger on the light switch. He flipped the switch and the hallway was bathed in a blinding light. And then he saw him. Why? Robby stood there, bathed in the harsh fluorescent light, his eyes wide and wild, a crowbar clutched in his hand. His clothes were disheveled, his hair a mess, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead. He looked like a cornered animal, desperate and dangerous. Joey stared at him, his mind reeling, a mixture of shock and disbelief washing over him.
"Robby, what are you doing here? What's going on?"
Robby didn't answer. He just stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on Joey with a chilling intensity.
"Robby, talk to me," Joey pleaded, his voice cracking with fear. "What's wrong? What have you done?"
A slow, cruel smile spread across Robby's face, transforming his features into a grotesque mask of hatred.
"What have I done?" he echoed, his voice dripping with malice. "I'm just getting started, Joey. I'm just evening the score."
And then, everything happened so fast. Robby lunged at Joey, the crowbar swinging through the air with a sickening thud. Joey, caught off guard, had no time to react. Pain exploded in his head as the crowbar connected, and then everything went black. When Joey regained consciousness, his head throbbed, and a wave of nausea washed over him. He was tied to a chair, his hands bound tightly behind his back, his ankles fastened to the legs of the chair. He struggled against the restraints, panic surging through him as he realized the gravity of his situation. He blinked, his eyes slowly adjusting to the dim light. He was in his own basement. The damp, musty air thick with the smell of mildew and something else, something metallic and cloying. He looked around frantically, his heart pounding in his chest. and then he saw them. Sarah, Lily, and Ethan lay sprawled on the floor in front of him, their lifeless eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Their bodies were covered in bruises, and blood stained their clothes a gruesome crimson. A strangled sob escaped Joey's lips, the horrifying reality of the situation crashing down on him with the force of a physical blow. Footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, slow and deliberate, each step sending a fresh wave of terror through him. He looked up, his eyes wide with fear, and saw Robby emerge from the shadows, a chainsaw dangling from his hand. But it wasn't the chainsaw that chilled Joey to the bone. It was the look in Robby's eyes. The envy, the resentment had been replaced by something cold and calculating, something utterly devoid of humanity.
"Why?" Joey croaked, his voice hoarse with terror and disbelief. "Why are you doing this?"
Robby chuckled, a chilling sound that echoed in the confines of the basement.
"Why?" he repeated, taking a step closer, the chainsaw buzzing menacingly. "Because it's not fair, Joey. You have everything and I have nothing. You took everything from me," Robby hissed, his voice thick with rage. "My wife, my job, my life. You made me feel like a failure, like a pathetic shadow in your perfect world. And for what? For what, Joey?"
He pressed the chainsaw against Joey's cheek, the cold metal sending shivers down his spine.
"You think you're better than me?" Robby snarled, his breath hot on Joey's face. "You think you deserve all this? The beautiful wife, the perfect kids, the big house? Well, let me tell you something, Joey. You don't deserve any of it."
He grabbed a can of gray paint from the workbench, and with a twisted smile, he emptied it over Joey's head. The paint dripped down Joey's face, stinging his eyes, blinding him. Robby then grabbed a rag and with agonizing slowness began to wipe the gray paint across Joey's eyes. "Don't worry, Joey," Robby whispered, his voice a menacing purr. "I won't kill you. Yet. I want you to see what I'm about to do." He stepped back, the chainsaw buzzing ominously. Joey, blinded by the paint, thrashed against his restraints, his heart pounding in his chest. A scream, primal and filled with unimaginable pain, ripped from Joey's throat as the chainsaw roared to life. The sound vibrated through his skull, drowning out all other thoughts, all other sensations. He thrashed wildly, his body convulsing in agony, but there was no escape. The chainsaw screamed again, closer this time, and then darkness. He floated in a void, an endless expanse of nothingness. Time had no meaning, pain a distant memory. He was adrift in a sea of darkness, his thoughts fragmented, his senses dulled. And then a voice deep and resonant filled the void. "Do you desire revenge, Joey Weaver?" The voice boomed, echoing through the emptiness. "Do you crave vengeance for the injustice you have suffered?" Joey clung to the voice, a flicker of hope igniting in the darkness. "Yes," he whispered, his voice raspy and weak. "I want revenge." The void shifted, swirling, churning, coalescing. 2 points of crimson fire pierced the black, burning with an infernal light. Joey felt a presence, vast and ancient, bearing down on him. It was not a physical sensation, but something far more profound. "You have been wronged, Joey Weaver," the voice rumbled. He was paralyzed, his will suffocated by the overwhelming presence. "I can give you the power to avenge them," the voice continued. Joey felt a flicker of something within him, a spark of defiance. A low chuckle, devoid of humor, reverberated through the void. "You misunderstand, Joey Weaver," the voice said, a hint of amusement in its tone. "Choose to embrace the power I offer, and you will have your revenge. Choose to remain as you are, and your torment will be eternal." The crimson eyes flared, casting flickering shadows that danced and writhed in the darkness. Joey felt a cold fire ignite within him, a flicker of something dark and primal. Section 3, Metamorphosis. Pain, excruciating and all-consuming, shot through Joey's body. It was as if every nerve ending was on fire, every muscle ripped apart and sewn back together. He wanted to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. He was vaguely aware of a voice, distant and echoing, chanting words in a language he didn't understand. His vision, blurred and distorted, offered glimpses of a world shifting and changing around him. The darkness remained, but it was no longer a void. It pulsed and throbbed with a malevolent energy, twisting and contorting into grotesque shapes that defied comprehension. He felt his body stretching, elongating, bones cracking and reforming, skin stretching taut over a frame that no longer resembled anything human. His senses, overwhelmed, sent a torrent of information flooding his brain. He could smell the fear of every living creature within a mile, hear the beating of their hearts, taste the terror that clung to their every breath. And then, as suddenly as it began, the pain subsided. It didn't disappear entirely, but it receded, becoming a dull ache, a constant reminder of the transformation he had undergone. He was no longer Joey Weaver, the loving husband and father. He was something else, something ancient and monstrous, something born of pain and fueled by vengeance. Section 4. The suit makes the man. He stood, feeling the ground tremble beneath his feet. Gone were the limitations of his human shell. A suit, black as midnight, clung to his elongated frame. He was a figure of contradictions, a monstrous entity clad in the trappings of civilization. Only a smooth, featureless surface as cold and unyielding as polished marble. He was vengeance incarnate, a creature of darkness and shadow. Section 5. A new reflection. The abyss shifted, the crimson eyes blinking slowly as if observing his transformation. "Go forth, Joey Weaver," the voice boomed. "Embrace your new purpose, unleash your pain upon the world." And then the abyss receded, the crimson eyes fading into the darkness. Joey found himself standing on familiar ground, the damp earth of his own backyard. He looked down at his hands, his fingers tipped with claws as sharp as razors. The moon, full and fat, hung low in the sky, casting long shadows. He could see the lights of his neighbors' houses, hear the faint murmur of their televisions. He was surrounded by the trappings of the life that had been stolen from him. He turned, his body moving with an unsettling fluidity, and looked at his house. It was dark and silent, the windows like empty eyes staring back at him. He could sense the lingering traces of his family's presence. But they were gone, and he was all that remained. Section 6. The birth of Slender Man. A surge of rage, cold and consuming, washed over him. He would become the embodiment of their fear, their nightmares given form. He took a step, his long limbs gliding effortlessly over the ground. He was something more, something less than human. He was the Slender Man. Section 1. The Hunter's Shadow. The world was a different place for Slender Man. He moved like a phantom, a whisper of darkness. He could be anywhere, any time. His presence heralded by a sudden drop in temperature. He had no need for food, no need for sleep, sustained by darkness and vengeance. He roamed the world, driven by a single purpose, to find Robby and make him pay. He began his hunt in the place where it all began, the small town where he had grown up. He moved like a wraith, his long white face a haunting mask. He lingered near the places where Robby had been, the bar where they had their fateful reunion, the park where they had played basketball as teenagers. He could sense Robby's presence, a faint but unmistakable stain. It was the scent of fear, of guilt. He was like a bloodhound, attuned to the slightest trace. He would not rest until he had found him. Section 2. Whispers in the Walls. Robby, meanwhile, was living a nightmare of his own making. He had tried to outrun the memory of that night, to drown his guilt in alcohol and drugs, but it was no use. The faces of his victims haunted his waking hours, their screams echoing in his ears. He was a prisoner in his own mind, tormented by the knowledge of what he had done. He had moved from town to town trying to outrun the past, but it was no use. The shadows followed him, whispering his name, reminding him of the blood on his hands. He saw the Slender Man everywhere he looked, in the reflection of shop windows, in the flickering shadows of streetlights, in the faces of strangers. He tried to convince himself that he was imagining things, that the Slender Man was just a figment of his guilty conscience. But deep down, he knew the truth. He had seen the look in the Slender Man's eyes, the cold, unwavering promise of retribution, and he knew that he would never be free of his past. He began to hear things, whispers in the dead of night, scratching sounds at his door. The television in his motel room flickered incessantly, even when it was unplugged. He was unraveling, his grip on reality slipping with each passing day. He was like a fly caught in a spider's web, struggling in vain against an inevitable fate. Section 3. Faces in the Static. Slender Man was relentless. He stalked Robby from the shadows, his presence a constant, terrifying reminder of his impending doom. He appeared to Robby in fleeting glimpses, a tall, faceless figure at the edge of his vision, a whisper of movement in the corner of his eye. He tampered with Robby's world, subtly at first, but with increasing intensity. He caused lights to flicker, appliances to malfunction, and phones to ring with eerie silence on the other end. He left behind unsettling signs of his presence, strange symbols scrawled on mirrors, children's drawings of a tall, faceless man. He invaded Robby's dreams, transforming them into vivid nightmares. Robby would find himself trapped in endless corridors, pursued by a silent, faceless figure. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding in his chest, the feeling of dread clinging to him like a shroud. He was slowly driving Robby mad, chipping away at his sanity piece by piece. He wanted Robby to suffer, to experience the same terror and despair that he had felt. He wanted Robby to beg for death, to welcome it as a merciful release from the torment he was enduring. Section 4. The walls are closing in. Robby's world shrank to the size of his paranoia. He became a recluse, afraid to leave his apartment, afraid to answer the phone, afraid of his own shadow. He covered the mirrors in his apartment with sheets. Unable to bear the thought of seeing the Slender Man's reflection staring back at him, he tried to distract himself with alcohol and drugs, but they only served to amplify his fear, to make the nightmares more vivid, the whispers louder. He was trapped in a spiral of madness, his grip on reality slipping further with each passing day. The Slender Man's presence grew stronger, more oppressive. Robby could feel him watching him, even in the supposed safety of his own home. He would catch fleeting glimpses of him out of the corner of his eye, a tall, faceless figure lurking in the shadows, its long, slender fingers twitching with anticipation. The television in his living room became a source of particular terror. It would switch itself on in the middle of the night, the screen filled with static, the sound a high-pitched whine that set his teeth on edge. And then, slowly, the static would begin to clear, resolving itself into the faint outline of a tall, thin figure. Section 5. The Smell of Fear. Robby's apartment, once a sanctuary, became a prison of his own making. He barricaded the doors and windows, piling furniture against them in a futile attempt to keep the Slender Man at bay. He slept with a knife under his pillow, his heart pounding in his chest, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside his window, sending a jolt of terror through him. The Slender Man played a cat-and-mouse game with him, appearing and disappearing at will, toying with his sanity, pushing him closer and closer to the edge. He would find notes left for him in his apartment, scrawled in a language he didn't understand, but which filled him with a primal dread. He tried to tell himself that he was going crazy, that none of it was real, but the evidence was all around him, in the strange occurrences, the unsettling signs, the ever-present feeling of being watched. He was trapped in a waking nightmare, and there was no escape. The scent of his own fear permeated the air, a sickly sweet aroma that seemed to draw the Slender Man to him. He was a prisoner in his own body, his mind a battleground where reason and madness clashed in a terrifying dance. One night, as Robby lay huddled in his bed, his body trembling with fear, he heard a knock at the door. His blood ran cold. He had been expecting this, dreading it, for weeks. He knew with a certainty that defied logic that the Slender Man was on the other side of that door. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. He just lay there, frozen in terror, as the knocking continued, slow and deliberate, each thud seeming to reverberate through his very bones. The knocking stopped. A long, drawn-out sigh, filled with an eternity of suffering and a lifetime of anticipation, seemed to emanate from the other side of the door. Then silence. Robby had never considered himself a brave man. He wasn't particularly strong or cunning, and he certainly wasn't prepared for the horrors that had become his reality. But something within him, perhaps a primal instinct for survival, or maybe just the sheer, overwhelming terror that had become his constant companion, pushed him to his feet. He had to see. He had to know. His heart pounded against his ribs, a frantic tattoo against his breastbone as he crept toward the door. Each step felt like a mile, his bare feet dragging on the worn carpet, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. He closed his eyes, bracing himself for the inevitable confrontation, and threw open the door. The hallway was empty. He stared at the empty hallway, his mind struggling to reconcile the sight with the dread that clawed at his insides. Had he imagined it? Was he finally losing his mind? Then he saw it. A single sheet of paper, pinned to the doorframe by a long, sharp object that was quickly withdrawn back into the shadows. He didn't need to touch it to know that the object was cold, impossibly cold, like the touch of death itself. His hand shook as he reached for the paper, his fingers brushing against the rough surface. The paper was cold, as if it had been stored in a freezer, and the ink was still slightly damp. A single word was scrawled across the page in a language he didn't recognize but which he understood with a chilling clarity. Follow. He didn't question it. He didn't hesitate. He simply turned and walked, his bare feet silent on the worn carpet of the hallway, his gaze fixed on the shadowed figure that moved just ahead of him. They walked in silence, Robby and his tormentor, through the deserted hallway, down the creaking stairs, and out into the night. They walked for what felt like hours, though time had lost all meaning for Robby. They walked through the sleeping town, past darkened houses and shuttered shops, the only sound the soft whisper of the wind and the rhythmic thud of their footsteps. They walked until the town was just a distant memory, until they were surrounded by the dense, suffocating darkness of the forest. They stopped in a small clearing, bathed in the pale light of the moon that had finally broken free of the clouds. Robby looked up, his gaze drawn to the tall, slender figure that stood before him. The Slender Man was closer than he had ever been, his suit as black as the surrounding shadows, his face a blank white mask that seemed to absorb the moonlight. He felt no fear, only a strange sense of peace, of acceptance. He had known, from the moment he had seen the Slender Man standing in his hallway, that this was how it would end. He had made his peace with that knowledge long ago. The Slender Man reached out, its long, slender fingers brushing against Robby's cheek. The touch was cold, impossibly cold, like the void that awaited him. He closed his eyes, a single tear tracing a path down his cheek, and whispered a silent prayer for forgiveness. The Slender Man leaned in close, its face inches from Robby's, and then, with a voice that seemed to emanate from the very depths of Robby's soul, it spoke. "This is not forgiveness, Robby. This is not an end. This is a beginning." The world was a canvas, and the Slender Man was the artist. He painted his masterpiece with shadows and fear, with whispers and nightmares. He was a creature of the night, a phantom that haunted the edges of perception, a reminder that even in the brightest of lights, darkness lurked just beneath the surface. He became a legend, whispered about in hushed tones around campfires and in darkened bedrooms. He was the boogeyman, the monster in the closet, the creature that stalked your dreams. He was the embodiment of our deepest fears, the personification of the unknown. Some dismissed him as a myth, a figment of our collective imagination, but others knew better. They had seen the signs, the strange occurrences, the unsettling images that hinted at his presence. They had heard the stories, whispered accounts of encounters with a tall, faceless figure in the woods, of children lured away into the darkness, never to be seen again. And so the legend of the Slender Man lived on, passed down from generation to generation, a chilling reminder that some things are best left undisturbed, some secrets best left buried in the shadows, for in the darkness he waits and he is always watching.